Ladies and gentlemen, our next session is What's Next for Common Core?
Good morning. So glad to be here. What a full room.
I'm good.
Thank you all so much for coming to this exceptionally important panel that we're going to talk about what's next for Common Core, the political future. And I just wanted to say a quick thank you to Dan Schneider and Matt Schlapp and Carly Fiorina for including me in the Independent Women's Forum. Again, at CPAC this year, we're always so happy to be here. And it's great to be down closer with everybody. It's a great setup, and we're so excited to have a wonderful conference with you. And what a testament to CPAC that they're starting off the first day with such an important topic about education and the Common Core. Because I think that when we consider some of our most critical problems facing the country, whether it's joblessness or poverty, crime, so much of it, the root of the problem really starts with our failing education system. And I think we all realize that there are far too many children who really don't have an opportunity to start life on the right foot. But while we all have the same goals in mind, I think that we also realize that there are a lot of differences in how we believe we should achieve and change the situation that we have. So of course, one side of the conservative aisle laments the absence of a marketplace in education. They believe that we need more decentralization, more competition in order to have a vibrant education system in America. And on the other side, we have something very different, where we believe that we need to have more consistent standards through the Common Core in order to keep schools accountable and to prepare students for college, for life, for their careers. So the debate over Common Core has become one about standards. Are they too rigid, too weak, too political? It's become about costs. Does it cost states more to implement Common Core than they will receive in their subsidies? It's about freedom, the role of parents versus that of government. And now, as we'll talk about today quite a bit, it's about politics and what it means for the upcoming elections. So here to discuss this really critical issue, not only dividing the country, but at risk of dividing conservatives and the Republican Party, are two fantastic education analysts who know this issue not only as policy experts, but also as parents. Neil McClusky on the left here is the Associate Director of the CATO Institute's Center for Educational Freedom. Previously, Neil served in the Army. He taught high school English, and he was a freelance reporter covering municipal government and education in New Jersey. He holds an undergraduate degree from Georgetown University, a master's from Rutgers, and he recently received his PhD from George Mason. He's also the author of Feds in the Classroom: How Big Government Corrupts, Cripples, and Compromises American Education. And Neil has 2 school-age children. Emmett McGroarty, to my left, is the director of the education program at American Principles Project, and he leads in its initiative to defend parental rights. He is the co-author of Controlling Education from the Top: Why Common Core is Bad for America, and he is co-founder of TruthinAmericanEducation.com, which is a nationwide network of individuals and organizations that shed light on the Common Core system. Also a graduate of Georgetown University and Fordham School of Law, Emmett also has 2 school-age children. So, Neil, I'd love to start with you. I think a lot of people here today know the basics about Common Core, but others may not, and I thought it might be good to start with what is Common Core and what are some of the misperceptions that we might have about it?
Yeah, so there are a lot of misconceptions about Common Core. Most basically what it is you can say, I think with most people agreeing, that is at a minimum, it's a set of standards in math and reading developed by the National Government Association and Council of Chief State School Officers. And that is where any agreement ends. The reality is it goes beyond just being some guidelines as it's often presented. But it is specifically about structuring the curriculum in math and English, and with a connection to science and to social studies. And it's connected to federally funded tests, the PARCC test and the SBAC test, on which schools and districts are held accountable. So your district or your school can be punished by how you do on those tests. And of course, what is tested is what's taught. That is why this is about curriculum. And the other misconception is people say, well, states voluntarily adopted the Common Core. And you could only say voluntary if you were also willing to say if somebody mugged you and then said, if you'd like your money back, all you have to do is give me your car, and you then have voluntarily given your car, then you could say it's voluntary. The reality is the federal government first said in 2009, if you wanted part of $4.35 billion, the race to the top, you had to, among other things, adopt the Common Core. And then they said if you want a waiver out of the No Child Left Behind Act, and almost every state wanted a waiver, you only had two standards options. Either the Common Core, which almost every state had already promised to adopt to try and get race to the top money, or you could have your state or a state college university system certify your standards as college and career ready. So the reality is what Common Core actually is it's very much curriculum standards, not just standards, but about your specific curriculum, and it is federally driven.
So Emmett, Neil says that the Common Core is all about curriculum, and I know that this is what's really important to you, is the content that we're finding is becoming so controversial, whether we're talking about climate change or sex ed or American history, evolution, all of these topics are becoming sort of at the center of the debate. What can you add about the content of Common Core that's so concerning?
Well, here's what's happening, and this is why this movement, and it is a movement, it's a national movement, has taken off so quickly, and I think, frankly, caught many politicians on both sides of the aisle by surprise. What's happening is that parents are looking at what's coming home in their children's backpacks, and they're appalled. And they're doing research, and they're finding out that the Common Core locks children into an inferior, low-quality education. To put it briefly, in math, Common Core ends in grade 11 with half an Algebra 2 course. Even the chief architect of the Common Core math standards, Jason Zimba, said Common Core is not for STEM. Common Core is not for admission to a competitive 4-year private or public university if you want to study the humanities. So in brief, what happens is, starting in the early grades, Common Core, before it teaches the standard way to solve a problem in math, it mandates the teaching of fuzzy math, or strategies for approaching problems. What are these strategies? There are things like counting on your fingers, drawing pictures, working with head nods to solve problems. And then Common Core teaches the standard way of solving a problem called the standard algorithm. So what happens is the progression, the needed progression, gets slowed down. So that by 8th grade, as Professor James Milgram, one of the foremost mathematicians in the world and a standards expert, as Professor Milgram of Stanford said, by 8th grade, a student on Common Core is about 1 or 2 years behind their peers in high-performing countries, or their peers in states that have good standards. So that's the problem, and then Common Core, as Milgram said, gets even worse in high school. It throws out Euclidean geometry, axiomatic Euclidean geometry, in favor of a method of teaching geometry that has failed everywhere in the world. It's been implemented K-12. That's now our national system of teaching geometry. And then it goes on to Algebra 2, but it only teaches half of an Algebra 2 course. It throws out most of trigonometry. So what you're left with is a child who does not even have a pathway to pre-calculus or calculus by 12th grade.
So Emmett, I would think that, excuse me, even if we could come to this perfect curriculum that everyone in this room agreed on, what's left for parents? I mean, what if you had a child who's really strong in the sciences and you have another child who's really strong in the arts? Do you have any say over their curriculum under this?
Well, this is the second part of what is driving this movement. Parents were upset with this process that Neil described, and they started peeling back the layers of the onion, and they realized that neither they nor their elected legislators had any say in what was being billed as a transformation of education for every child in America. And they're upset about that, and they're going to war, and I use that in the figurative sense, they're going to war against anything that interferes with their right to have a say in what their children learn. And that includes Republicans in Congress, it includes Democrats in Congress, it includes the current attempt to reauthorize No Child Left Behind. This is a very, very strong movement. It's a very passionate movement, and it's one that is growing by the day.
And it sounds like they have a lot of work to do, because you're saying that parents don't have a say, but if I'm correct, Neil, 45 states and the District of Columbia have adopted Common Core. Is that correct? We only had Alaska, Nebraska, Texas, my state of Virginia that initially refused, right? Then we had Minnesota, who only adopted the ELA, or the English Language Arts Standards. And then now we've seen Indiana, Oklahoma drop out. South Carolina looks poised to drop out next year. Is that correct? So maybe you can give us a little lay of the land. What's coming down the pike? Where are the states going? Are they pushing back now?
Yeah, so it's, if you include South Carolina, you'd have about 42 states that are with us. But understand, this year South Carolina is actually part of it. Where you've seen actually across the country, and you've seen it in blue states like New York, you've seen it in red states like Arizona, there's been, as Emmett described, a huge, really grassroots, parent-driven revolt against the Common Core. Understanding that Common Core was adopted in a process for Race to the Top, where a governor and a chief state school officer just signed a promise that said, we want this money and we promise we'll adopt Common Core. And then if anybody in the state objected, they would lose that money, or the possibility to get that money. And all this happened during the Great Recession, when everybody was focused on the recession, not a small part of the stimulus, relatively small compared to the whole stimulus, that handed over control of the curriculum of their schools to the federal government. They weren't paying attention to that. It wasn't until this hit districts in around 2011, 2012, that suddenly the public became aware that this often very strange curriculum was being imposed on their schools. And that's when people started to say very loudly, what is this? Where did it come from? I don't like it. How do we get rid of it? The problem in most states that have tried to outright repeal it has been, well, for several years now, the whole education system has been moved to align with Common Core. Most states are giving Common Core aligned tests, and they have to give these tests as part of the No Child Left Behind Act. And so what we've seen is many states try and outright eliminate the Common Core, but that's been very hard because of the investment they made when people didn't know it was happening. What we have seen, and this may be where you get the most movement, although it is very important at states to say we don't want this, is lots of states have dropped out of the two federally funded testing consortia, right, PARC and SBAC. And if you can get out of the tests and your state can run your own tests, then for all intents and purposes, you can begin to reclaim control of your state's education system. You can start to do what the Constitution requires, which is that the federal government not control any of this, and that the state and local governments, and ideally parents through school choice, control education.
It seems like we are at a crossroads where we have a potential to sort of see what we saw with Obamacare, where there's going to be a difference in terms of the strategy or the approach that we take to rolling this back. And I wonder, on one hand, we're saying it's grassroots, parent-driven. On the other hand, Politico ran an article just this week talking about how Republican lawmakers are trying to sabotage the law. The idea being that they're trying to defund it, in effect, right, through defunding of textbooks and the tests. Do you have a sense, either of you, of which will be the better strategy?
Well, I'm even at a loss to call it a strategy, because truly what is driving this is the moms sitting down, reading through these laws and connecting the dots and getting on the phone and talking with other moms. And many of these have not been involved in paying attention to politics before. I'm also at a loss. The Democratic Party of the state of Washington recently passed a resolution condemning Common Core. The teachers' unions are starting to speak out against it. So I really don't think that this is just a Republican versus Democrat movement. But I am certain about one thing. What has changed is now people are starting to look at that division of powers between the national government and the state governments, and they're starting to realize that it is meant to protect their personal rights and their ability to direct government, and they're starting to have a personal attachment to making sure that we remain faithful to that division of powers. And I think that's going to really dramatically change the political landscape in the coming years.
Yeah, I think Emmett made a crucial point, which is that opposition to Common Core is not something that's controlled or orchestrated or engineered or even strategized from the top down. You know, our groups aren't coordinating grassroots opposition or something like that. This is really something that we've seen grow in every state, really from the bottom up. Generally speaking, Common Core support. Now, there are a lot of people like Common Core who I think are well-intentioned, think we need, certain standards for everybody. I think that that's wrong, but I think they're well-intentioned. But a lot of the the support for Common Core is, I think, more centrally strategized. U.S. Chamber of Commerce and groups like that have very concerted campaigns to try and support the Common Core. So I do think it's important to understand that this is really just people who are unhappy about what's happened to their schools, and they're rising up to oppose it.
The strategy of the proponents has always rested on certain talking points. I think it's important to realize those talking points were crafted, that strategy was crafted before the Common Core was drafted. And those talking points are, well, this is state-led, and as Neil described, it's not, that the standards will be rigorous, internationally benchmarked, and evidence-based. And the fact of the matter is, none of those things are true. But they're hanging on to those talking points because really, if people realize, which is what's happening, that those talking points are false, the Common Core collapses, and that's what we're seeing.
Well, and one of the other talking points is that all of the opposition to the Common Core is politically driven, right? I read one article this week where one of the more prominent supporters of Common Core said that this is all about conservatives' dislike for the president. But I think that we're all agreeing that is far from the truth. But it does bring us back to this issue of the political ramifications of this. And what does this mean? I think we're all thinking about the 2016 election. What does this mean for the presidential election? We're seeing all of the different presidential candidates sort of start to throw their hats into the ring. Maybe we should take a minute and sort of think about what this will look like another 9-10 months from now. What can we expect from the different presidential candidates on the Republican side?
Yeah, I think the first thing that's important about this is it's absolutely, this jumping off point is the Common Core itself. But this has really become a bigger debate about what is the role of government generally, what is the role of the federal government, and then what is the role of government in education. And I think that what you're seeing is, yes, there's opposition to the Common Core. There's a lot in the Common Core as curriculum or as content people don't like. I think there is a fair amount of misinformation about what is or is not in there. For instance, sex education is not in the Common Core. But what has clearly become the central part of now burgeoning presidential election is what possible justification is there for the federal government to be pushing one curriculum, and because that's really what these standards are about. It's about shaping the curriculum, pushing that on every school, and therefore every student, at least public school and public student, although private schools are also affected, in America. And so you've started to see people like Rand Paul talk about this. You've seen Jeb Bush talk about, well, we at least need to have high standards, maybe not the Common Core now, but at least high standards for everybody. And the question is always going to be, but who is it that should choose these standards? And I think that's how this debate is shaping up. And then the question is, well, how crucial will it be to somebody whether or not they're for or against the Common Core? That I don't know. But it is certainly a good indicator, or one indicator, of where candidates stand on the role of the federal government in education.
I think the question in the Republican nomination process is not going to be, are you for or against the Common Core? Question is, are you fighting the Common Core? Right. And are you fighting for change in the federal government that will prevent this travesty like this from ever happening again? And that's what candidates are going to have to answer. What are they going to do? I think the voters want acknowledgement that the Common Core is of poor quality and was forced upon them. Because if candidates don't acknowledge that, then they're not facing the truth. And the indication then, the fear then will be, well, they're really not going to fight this. But people realize that when the federal government is dictating education, they have no control over that. And why is that? It's because the federal government acts through the state governments, the state executive branch to be specific. So there's this conversation going on between the federal government, which has the conditional money. So the states look to the federal executive and they start doing what the federal executive wants. They adopt their policies, and it really doesn't matter who's in office, they tend to adopt those policies to the exclusion of their legislators and to the exclusion of their people. And that's what people are realizing, that as long as that conversation is going on for that conditional money, that extra money, that's how that 10% of an education budget really controls policy. As long as that conversation is going on, people now realize they're being cut out. They and their desires and their needs and their children are being cut out of the decision making. And so I think this represents a very profound change in America. People are realizing that division of powers is a very personal thing. It's a very, very personal concept meant to protect their rights and their liberties.
Well, Neil, you covered New Jersey politics. You're from New Jersey. I'm thinking about this politically. I mean, is this going to become one of these I was for it before I was against it kind of moments for the Republican Party? I mean, just this last week, I guess it was, that Chris Christie sort of did an about-face on this issue. Is it going to be enough to turn away from it, or are we going to have to see our candidates actually start to attack it at its core for what it is?
My suspicion, and from what we've been able to observe, is that states, whether they're red or blue, are all facing opposition to the Common Core. And even people who once were sort of enthusiastic, I think, about supporting it, or at least they weren't afraid to say they liked it, are now turning against it. I think this is in part, though, because they've started to really grasp what this means. Because in particular, right now, we have, for the first time, states are giving these PARCC tests, the SBAC tests, the federally funded tests that go with the Common Core. And across the political spectrum, or the ideological spectrum, you see lots of parents who are just angry about this. They see how much time is taken up with testing, the infatuation with testing. They may or may not even like what's in the Common Core, but they really don't like the testing. How it is then going to be connected to evaluating teachers, potentially evaluating students. And so, because it's become real to everybody now, it's not just a notion, but their kids are actually sitting through these things. You have opposition in New Jersey, you have it in blue New York, you have it in red Arizona, you have it really across the country. And I think everybody, regardless of party, who's running for an office, anybody running for president, is going to have to talk about, is it appropriate and is it constitutional for the federal government to try and impose uniformity and test obsession on everyone? And I don't get the sense many politicians are going to at least full-throatedly say, yes, we should do things the way we've been doing them.
Well, it's not surprising, I don't think, that we as conservatives, by extension Republicans, are having this conversation. But I do think it's interesting that we're going to see it come up, I think, in Democratic circles, right? I mean, Emmett, I think it's going to be, when we look at how Democrats will handle this, I was just going to read a brief excerpt from a New York Times article last spring where it said it's not just conservatives who have turned against the Common Core. The leaders of major teachers' unions are also pushing back because of the new, more difficult tests aligned to the standards that are being used to evaluate both students and teachers. It's giving teachers a whole lot less freedom and flexibility for the good ones. It's making it difficult for the bad ones. They have to constantly be testing. Where are Democrats going to fall on this?
Well, they're going to be opposed to it. And this is not a static movement. It is growing very quickly. And here's the danger for Republicans. I think almost all of the presidential candidates on the Republican side will be against the Common Core. That could fracture the vote, and you could end up with a pro-Common Core nominee. So what will happen in the general? I think that pro-Common Core nominee will go against likely Hillary Clinton, who does not really have Common Core baggage. And that is going to make the Republican candidate, I think, unelectable at that time, because you're going to have the conservative votes will be disappointed. Their turnout will be suppressed and low. I think you'll have the moderate votes or the apolitical votes will vote for the other candidate, for the one who doesn't have the Common Core baggage. And Mrs. Clinton is very smart, very shrewd. She will be able to criticize this, and it'll almost sound like a Republican criticizing the Republican nominee. She'll criticize it for the decision making. She'll criticize it for the heavy-handedness of the federal government. She'll criticize it because all these leaders signed on to the standards and committed to the standards before they were drafted. On and on and on. It'll be very, very embarrassing for the Republican nominee.
Hillary has also come out in favor of stricter standards from time to time, is that right? But you think when push comes to shove, she'll take the anti-government role.
But the Common Core, the promise was that these would be good standards, and they're not. They're poor standards, and they're not evidence-based. I mean, the ELA standards, the English standards, shifts from the study of classic literature to informational texts. Well, what are informational texts? Informational texts are simpler texts. They're texts meant to clearly convey a message to a broad audience. So you don't get those analytical abilities. You don't learn. You don't get the acquisition of vocabulary or learn how to express yourselves in verbal and written form as much as those who study classic literature.
Do they use primary texts in the Common Core?
The Common Core doesn't exclude primary text, but I think the difference is the quality of the text. Studies show that people who read classic narrative literature are better readers, period, than those who read informational texts. Right. They're even better readers of informational texts. So this Common Core idea of reading more informational texts and less classic literature has no evidentiary basis.
Neil, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's important to take from this is whatever the quality of the Common Core, the fact of the matter is, first, most basically, all kids are different. And this is something we lose sight of in this debate. All kids learn different things at different rates, have different desires, abilities, goals in life. And to think that it makes sense to have one set of standards that do have a heavy impact on curriculum for everyone is just nonsensical. This is why our fight needs to be away from centralizing more, federalizing. And I think what's crucial and what research suggests is the key to educational success is move to school choice. Connect money in one way or another to kids and empower parents and family to choose schools, give educators free. I'm glad to hear school choice get some applause because everything else we said probably deserves boos. But truly, and give educators freedom to try different things. Why is this? Because nobody is omniscient. Nobody knows what, even if it were possible to have one best curriculum for all kids, nobody knows what it is. Therefore, you have got to allow other ideas to compete with each other, to see what works best for different subsets of kids. And something really crucial that we never got to have a national debate on, because Race to the Top immediately took us to having national standards, is there research basis to say that having national standards leads to better outcomes? When there was a little bit of talk of this, when people who supported national standards thought maybe there'd have to be a national debate, they would say to basically, well, every country that does better than we do has national standards, so therefore we need them. Well, the reality is most countries that have done better than us on tests have national standards, but some don't. Also, most countries that do worse than we do on national standards, on international tests, have national standards, but some don't. There is no correlation, in other words, between having national standards and outcomes. And I should note that our neighbors to the north, Canada, they don't even have any sort of national Department of Education. Further looking at the research shows there is no research evidence to say having national standards leads to better outcomes. And so much of the promise about Common Core has been if we just nationalize things, they'll get better. And we never even got to talk about, is there any evidence to support that?
Well, Neil, and I'm thinking about this sort of in the larger culture that we live in, right? I mean, today, in all areas of our life, we're moving away from standardization, right? Tonight, I can watch whatever I want on TV at whatever time. I can customize my groceries and have them delivered to my door. I can go online and work with a personal stylist to make my unique style at affordable prices, right? Everything in our life is moving away from standardization. Yet when government gets into the business of running, whether it's healthcare or now education, we find that it's the absolute opposite. So is all of this talk about will Republicans push back or will Democrats push back, does it not matter? Will this bill just fall of its own weight because it doesn't fit with our culture today?
I don't know that it'll fall of its own weight. It may, but there is a sort of simplistic power to the argument that says, well, all we want to do is hold everybody to the same high standard. The assumption in that is that all kids are the same, right. But people hear this in politics, and of course, nobody wants to be the person who said, well, I won't hold them to high standards. Right. Of course, again, all kids are different, and we don't actually all agree on what high standards are. But the good news is, actually, people will tend to choose, and we've seen this over and over, not just in education, they'll tend to choose a lot of the same things because it's in all our best interest as individuals to speak the same language as other people, to know a certain amount of math, to know the same American culture and history, and that's how we interact and that's how we succeed. So you actually would have lots of national continuity and similarities. It's just we wouldn't try and force a single model on everyone, knowing that that one model doesn't work best for everyone.
You would have competition for, as opposed to monopoly that is Common Core. And you know, you brought up school choice, and I think it's worth bringing up 2 points when we talk about school choice. I think for about 20 or 30 years, the Republican mantra on education has pretty much been school choice, school choice, school choice. And when people ran for political office on the Republican side, they dropped a few lines on school choice and then moved on to the next issue. The real principle is, are parents empowered? Do parents have a say in what's going on? And if you look at what happened to school choice, in Indiana, there's a voucher law, but the voucher law was tied to the state test. The state test is a Common Core test. As a result, now all the Catholic schools in Indiana are teaching Common Core. And what's happened since then is the states just keeps attaching strings to the voucher. And on the charter school side, we have to be careful. Many charter schools are corporate owned. There's even chains of charter schools. They can be even owned by corporations that aren't based here in the United States. So through that mechanism, parents could actually be disempowered. Through both of those mechanisms, parents could be disempowered.
And what about the tax credit approach? Would that somehow protect parents from greater government intervention because it's their dollars, or? Right,
so there are many ways to deliver school choice. I mean, people know charter schools, like you said. What they don't often realize is charter schools are public schools. They have to go to a public entity, usually the school district with which they want to compete, ironically, and they get a charter to operate. That means they have to follow state standards, give state tests, things like that. And then more people know that generally you can get a voucher, is what people think of, in order to go to a private school. But Emmett's absolutely right. What we've seen is that vouchers, will certainly better than the status quo, tend to get a lot of regulations placed on them because people say, look, the state is taking my money and giving it to someone else, and I want that school to teach what I want it to teach. I want it to use the money how I want the money used. And what we've seen is that tax credit programs are much less regulated. And it's not just that you get a tax credit when you send your child to a private school, although certainly that's something you should get. But when an individual or a corporation donates to a scholarship granting organization that then gives out scholarships, you get school choice, but they're not regulated because One, you choose whether you want to make that donation or go to that school. And two, in many states you can choose among lots of different groups that give out scholarships. More freedom tends to mean less regulation. And I should point out there's now one other kind of burgeoning option, these education savings accounts. They have them in Arizona, they're just starting them in Florida, where there's a problem in that you get the money directly from the state. There's a regulation issue there. But you essentially, your child gets money put into an account that they can use for any educational expense. It could be a computer while going to a public school. It could be private school tuition. It could mean you save it and use it for college. Again, the important thing is there is more freedom involved, and that tends to lead to less regulation.
Well, to wrap up, I would love to get your final sort of policy and maybe political predictions of what's going to happen with this law. What should people be looking for, and maybe where people can take a little action themselves so that they leave CPAC feeling like there's something they can do, whether it's participating with another organization, whether it's getting out there and speaking with their lawmakers. What is it that the people in this room here today can go home and do?
Well, I would say there's two websites they could go to. Parents Against the Common Core, that's sponsored by the American Principles Project, and there's resources and information there. Then there's also this independent network, Truth in American Education, which is a network of parents, and you could go there and find the group in your state that's working to fight Common Core. Then there are other groups out there fighting Common Core that aren't on that website, but I think that would be a good place to start. And what are these groups? These are groups of parents, moms mostly, who are networking with each other. Many of them have done thousands and thousands of hours of research on all of these connected topics. And they're going into their state house, and they're going up to their governors and meeting with their governors and senators and representatives, and they're demanding that their legislature reclaim their say, reclaim their authority over what's going on in education.
And I will just add that it's not just women that are affected as mothers. I'm a mom of 3 little children, so I definitely understand that, but also as teachers. Women are still overwhelmingly overrepresented as teachers, and they are definitely going to feel the impact of these new standards. Neil, any final thoughts in terms of policy and politics?
Yeah, well, I'm duty-bound to say you should go to CATO's Center for Educational Freedom, www.cato.org. That's the CATO website. You'll find us there. Lots of good stuff on the Common Core. I think the message that needs to be sent to policymakers at any level, and not just about the Common Core, is that parents and families, and ultimately students, especially as they get older, they need to be the ones empowered to make decisions that are best for them as unique individuals. We can no longer say that what's important is the system, or that we all are doing the same thing. And so if you make that argument, if you say that enough, if you demand school choice and real power for you as individuals, that would take care of the Common Core and all sorts of other things. And really the Common Core, again, I think in some cases well-intentioned, they wanted to fix problems of a monopoly system. Problem is they decided to make a worse monopoly. So just demand that you get power to make your own educational decisions.
Right on time. Look at that. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I hope that you will check out more at the Cato Institute, APP, IWF. I'll see you next time.